Okay, you guys, welcome to another episode of Paradigm Profiles. Today, you guys are going to get something a little different. Today's episode will highlight a book that was written by former NF member Hector Copas Gallegos from Salinas. This is an opportunity for you guys to hear an exclusive portion of this book written directly from Copas himself. Copas was a good C, someone who I knew and respected personally. Like so many others before him, he got caught up in some underhanded politics. He took a 20-year federal sentence after being indicted with several members of his crew in Salinas. And after he was convicted and shipped off to federal prison, he became another NF casualty. So without further ado, here's the beginning of his book. One Man's Experience from Within the Bowels of Hell, Pelican Bay State Prison, Species of a Lesser God, by Hector Gallegos. This is an account of a journey traveled by the men in the solitary confines of Pelican Bay State Prison, a voyage into the violent, misshapen world warped by man's miscreant spirit, stripping other men of not only their freedom, but of their association with other human beings and of their personal sense of purpose and awareness, where common compassion, pity, and human decency is virtually unheard of, and where the little death of mental cruelty and physical torture slowly peels away at the heart of humanity. It's a venture which would lead us all on a path of becoming fantasists with little regard to what truth really was. Locked in a lopsided world of violence, delusions, and fear, this journey would also prove to be a time of incredible transition that was to teach many of us a hell of a lot about ourselves and about the world in which we live. To accommodate the reader with a closer look at the daily existence of the men housed in the security units of Pelican Bay, this story is told by way or one man's encounters, bearing in mind that the emotional and psychological aspects of its account is an experience shared by all the men incarcerated therein. Pelican Bay State Prison. Forward. This book began as an ambitious personal project, a quest born of a burning need to find meaning in and during one of the darkest corners of my life. This experience, which was my life for 7 long years, played itself out in a very chilling context. An experience thus, fare the greatest, most pitiful paradox I've known yet in my life. The terror of individual being and the ever-raging desire to exist. That this took place within the confines of the most depraved, isolated, and suffocating prison, segregated units of California did much to determine my present view of the world, perception of self, and that of the human condition. But more than anything, it was the torment of reconciling the pain of existence with a consuming hunger to live, which would ultimately lead me through the loneliest corridors of my soul, across the coldest expanses of the hinterland, of relived personal tragedy, the horrific truths of self, and finally, the fulcrum upon which this paradox is precariously balanced. It is within this balance between the suffering of existence and the reality of living where I found a powerful, hidden truth that gave my life a deeper meaning. I say this with a deep-rooted conviction because I have come face to face with what has been said are among man's greatest fears: the fear of death, fear of the dark, and fear of being alone. Before I continue, however, I wish to briefly define what is meant by this writer in having faced the fears described above, so that the intended meaning is not lost on the reader. And more importantly, because I believe it provides for a much needed point of departure into the journey in this book, and further gives the reader a basis from where the imagination is better able to perceive the underlying message, which yearns so strongly and with such passion to express itself. A story that not only wants, but needs to be told. In any case, when I speak of having faced the fear of death, I do not mean death as in the clinical sense of the word, but rather of two aspects of the one thing, both of which are inherently essential to the phenomenon of death. One being symbolic of death, as in the symbolism of dying, and the other of a physio-psychological color. The prisoner who has given it some thought, in particular, the ones confined in extremely isolated conditions such as those found in the maximum lockup security housing units, SHU, of Pelican Bay State Prison, where this book was written, soon finds himself faced with a terribly frightening reality that, with the exception of a few loving family members or maybe a dear friend or two, he no longer exists to the outside world. He is dead to the free world because he is no longer a part of it. The only thing that remains of him out there are memories, thoughts, and the love for him vigilantly kept in the sanctity of the hearts and minds of his family or perhaps that friend or lover. As such, one is nothing more than a ghost of his former self in a world beyond the walls in which he is confined. This point is nailed home when one realizes how much of his life has passed him by, while he sits in the same cell year after year, and how much he yearns for it. What is past, he can never be a part of. It is as if he has died and observes this from a reality which indeed perhaps only the dead would understand. This is the symbolic death. Another aspect of the symbolism of death experienced by a prisoner is when he discerns that by the mere fact of incarceration, he has killed the him that would have been. For the lover he wishes to be, the father he cannot be, the son he has failed to be, the person he has never grew into, he has in essence killed, at least for the duration of his confinement, that part of himself. In this sense, and for that time, he may as well be dead, for he cannot be there to be that person. The prisoner lives on the dark side of the moon. He is tormented by two worlds, the one he lives in and the one he left behind, caught like Odyssey between Scylla and Charybdis. I don't know how to pronounce them words and I don't give a fuck. In regard to the physio-psychological aspect of death, what is meant here is the collective summation of the effects on a person subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation in a setting such as the SHU. Here, a prisoner is no longer able to experience the simpler things in life that most people take for granted. The warmth of the sun, sensation of a cool breeze, the sight of birds in the air, or the touch of another human being. These things, essential and common to the human experience, are but cherished memories kept alive out of necessity by the prisoner. He no longer experiences what the rest of the living world does in a place where panoramic views are non-existent. And when man is deprived in this fashion for a lengthy amount of time, he gradually, unwittingly transforms into a misshapen creature of sorts. But this is only a precursory feature of the outrage committed upon the prisoner's sense of being, for a far more sinister type of death ominously awaits him like a silent vulture perched upon a leafless tree awaiting death. For he whose strength is insufficient to endure the quiet, subtle, yet overwhelming launch of assaults upon his mental and spiritual stability will gradually give way to perhaps the saddest, cruelest death a man can suffer. Death of the mind and will to live. Imperceptibly, this onslaught takes its toll on the prisoner, like in the unrelenting pounding of waves against a rock on a seashore, slowly reducing it to grains of sand with the passing of time. And so is the prisoner's sense of reality washed away bit by bit, his overall sense of self-worth quietly and maliciously gnawed away at by monotony and emptiness. Death by attrition, pernicious, slow, sure, and maddeningly relentless. I can describe what I just have with such clarity and with such vividness because I gave witness to it all around me in the catacombs of the Pelican Bay SHU, and because, like any experience that cannot wholly be understood by mere observation, I lived it. I, like the countless others whose misfortune it was and continues to be in the SHU, know how cold and terrifying it is to be in the darkness of oblivion. An oblivion that compelled me to understand that the only reason I truly existed was because I wanted to exist. But what's even more terrifying is that the realization that within this oblivion, my thoughts alone prove my existence. For in the face of such emptiness, I had nothing more with which to measure it. Questions such as, in what context do I exist, would pound away at me. Why do I exist? For what purpose? What does it all mean? And most of all, who am I? I was forced to. The isolation of the SHU demanded that I think. Otherwise, I would have surely drowned in paralyzing numbness, living out a slow death. Even as I write this spiel, I wonder if my words are not merely the ravings of a madman, if perhaps I am already submerged in that numbness. To question one's sanity or existence is at first a distressing conundrum, because when the questions are posed, initially, there are no viable answers. One shouts out these interrogations in the seemingly empty canyons of thought, only to be reciprocated with haunting echoes of the same questions. To realize this is to understand the pressing need for meaning in one's life. I found that one must travel through the crucible of self-examination and through all of its fires and torments to arrive at the answers. It's learning to face and confront man's fears, death, darkness, and loneliness before he is able to move in on his search for his own life's meaning. It is here, in this gulag of concrete steel and misery, where I came to learn the subtle difference between existing and living. This self-discovery came by way of learning what it feels like spending countless hours in the icy, cold grip of loneliness. Through this experience, I am able to understand why so many people dread and are so utterly afraid of being alone. On the other hand, I also know the strength and insight that solitude can provide a man with, a piece of knowledge attached to the price of bitterness. This story is not just a heart-wrenching account of human misery in the whole of solitary confinement, but also of the collective experience that living in such a place entails, which I believe gives the reader a penetrating insight into the human condition as a whole. If Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, were still alive today, he would revel to find the psychic of Auschwitz alive and thriving well in Pelican Bay Shoe. In the wake of modern society that advocates humanity and equal justice for all, we find here that the lessons learned in the history of places such as Auschwitz were lessons all too soon forgotten in segments of our society. Lessons which have been manipulated and cloaked beneath the cape of high-tech maximum security prisons and the ever-necessary need for punishment propagated by the modern-day angels of death. While still inside this factory of suppressions, through my writings, I found a painful need to reach out for a medium expression, not only for myself, but for those others as I, whom are still struggling to find a rational context for it all. Whether it be within the neglected confines of a convalescent home, the abused-filled quarters of a psychiatric ward, or many obscure closets, attics, and dark corners of society where a person may be kept for whatever distorted or rational purpose. Prologue. Indelibly etched in the canyons of memory, I can remember being herded onto the Grey Goose, as these transportation prison buses are commonly known throughout the California penal system. The solemn procession of shackled prisoners wore a quiet, somber, ghostly mask. I cannot quite describe with any degree of accuracy the feeling that settled over us prior to boarding. There was an ominous silence which hung thickly in the air, like a heavy dark cloud forecasting the coming of wickedly vicious storm. It projected a turmoil that was to progressively descend over my soul, like a fierce, savage moving monsoon. Indeed, one which we would all come to know in the life-negating emptiness that awaited our arrival in the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, SHU. The low drone of the bus's engine anxiously hummed its readiness to transport our bodies inexorably to the God-forsaken Temple of Doom. That same anxiousness was also apparent in the cold, apathetic stare of the armed transportation guards, who on occasion would bark out innuendos emphasizing the inevitableness of our lot. One by one, waist-chained and cuffed, we stepped into the belly of the Grey Goose, a reminiscent to those victims herded onto boxcars on their way to Auschwitz and other death camps. Looking back in retrospect, it seems rather odd, even sadistic, that it were moments such as these that ironically served as lessons to me of the deliberate, cynical twist of fate that perversely taunted my spirit of life. The bittersweet irony of acceptance. The ability to accept one's fate, how one carries his inner cross, is ultimately what separated the prisoners who weakened and lost their will to struggle from those who found strength and meaning in the twisted, fragmented world of the SHU. Verily, I for one have come to believe that inner strength and the will to survive in the shoe came by way of confronting one's present state of being and in coming to terms with it. I had no idea of the price which was to be exacted from me for learning this lesson. Initially, the only thing I did know for sure before I embarked on this journey was that once the bus began to roll towards its destination, like fate, there was no stopping it. The heat inside the bus was as stifling as the silence which every one of the prisoners appeared to be lost in. The trance-inducing drone of the big diesel engine lulled me into reflections of my life. Everything from remembrances of my childhood, family, past loves, to my failures, and to the chores yet left undone in my life. Sitting there, it seemed as though I ran the gaunt of my life's memories. And then in poignant afterthought, I realized that those memories had soared past me like the natural scenery flying by outside the barred, tinted windows of the anonymous gray goose I was riding in, and as swiftly as the life I had carelessly led thus far. The restless dismal chimes of shackles and chains broke me away from the melancholy spell I had fallen under, and there followed a sudden apprehension which gripped my heart with a cold awakening. It dawned on me that the tangible world of oceans, mountains, and landscapes would all soon be but a vivid memory of another lifetime. Looking about, I found not to be alone in my contemplation, for other prisoners were entertaining similar thoughts, but no one dared speak of them. What awaited us at Pelican Bay Shoe, with its featureless view and eerily silent corridors, was a purgatory of sorts, where one enters into a vacuum of uncertainty, sealed off from everything and everyone, where one is virtually entombed in an isolated cell, whose scarred and pitted walls depict the idleness, boredom, and in some cases, lunacy of a previous occupant. A morbid place where a concrete bed awaits, stained by tears of anger and frustration, incited by endless days of broken hope and lonely nights of shattered dreams. Here, the only thing that was to remind me of my existence would be the screams in the night and pounding in my own head. I was to join the countless others who had glazed eyes set amidst dark rings, shadows of anguish clung desperately to their very souls. There is a look in the shoe prisoner's eyes that is haunting, a foreboding look from the eyes that had themselves stared into the eyes of madness and human cruelty, eyes that have stared into the abyss of emptiness, eyes belonging to a species of a lesser god. Chapter 1. Dry words on paper cannot adequately capture the senseless suffering and sometimes wretched misery that unconstitutional practices leave in their wake. The anguish of descending into serious mental illness, the pain of physical abuse, or the torment of having serious medical needs simply go unmet is profoundly difficult, if not impossible, to fully fathom. Judge Thelton Henderson, U.S. District Court, Madrid vs. Gomez, Pelican Bay, Prison, Civil Rights Suit, 1995. Species of a lesser god. I was a dead man walking, I thought to myself, but it was more of a feeling actually than a thought as we began to close the last mile to the quagmire in which vulgarity overwhelms human decency. Or perhaps it was simply fatigue coupled with carbon monoxide which had been seeping through the floorboard of the bus that made me feel so morosely. Whatever the reason, my ass was numb as my mind from having to sit, chained in one place, along with 28 other prisoners for the 12 long hours it took to make the long journey. I remember thinking to myself as we neared our dreaded destination of how beautiful the stately Northern California redwoods lining the scenic route along Highway 101 were. In all their majestic grandeur, these giant trees seemed to come alive, larger than life against the breathtaking expanse of a cloudless blue sky above. It was electric, and then, from seemingly out of nowhere, the serenity of natural beauty was rudely shattered by the daunting figure of Pelican Bay State Prison. Aroused by the visual encounter of the prison, which had imposingly thrust itself into view, a sudden restlessness betrayed the primordial instinct in us all to survive. Survive by killing or running. The pungent stench of anxious energy, like the raw scent of an animal before a kill, soon filled the bus. It exuded from the pores of prisoners who were all too familiar with the cold reality of entering the uncharted territory of a new prison. A world in which brutal force and raw, unremorseful violence unfailingly enforced the natural law of survival of the fittest. From my vantage point, the security housing units, SHU, of Pelican Bay strangely resembled a massive graveyard. Monolithic blocks of gray concrete which formed the tomb-like structures sprawled in every direction, dominating the grounds of the prison. I looked on regrettably as the bus impatiently advanced through one security gate after another. "Damn," Richie Boy whispered, a convict sharing the seat next to mine. "This place looks like something out of a Hitler blueprint," he said as he looked apprehensively in every direction out of the dusty bus windows. "Probably is," I replied tentatively, wondering how far from the actual truth we might be. Whispers rose throughout the bus as other prisoners quietly expressed their own misgivings to one another. And then a sudden medley of voices and clanking of chains filled the putrid stale air as the bus reached the final security gate. And then a sudden medley of voices and clanking of chains filled the putrid stale air as the bus reached the final security gate. And as suddenly as it started, it ended in an abrupt silence. A hush fell over the prisoners while the huge gate slowly heaved open, unhinging wide steel jaws like some giant serpent in preparation of its next meal. The bus seemed to rumble with a hesitancy all its own as it slowly made its way past the entrance to the SHU. As we passed the gate, the foreboding SHU compound intruded upon everyone's field of vision on board. The bus rolled slowly forward another 50 yards before it came to an emphatic stop. Every one of us seemed drawn to the great edifice that blankly stared back at us with its anonymous gray walls. That it was so clean and silent left us all feeling quite unsettled. One might expect a filthy, noisy, time-worn prison block like so many of the other prisons we've become accustomed to, with their broken windows, riotous clamor, and signs of whereby habitation. These at last bore some sordid kind of homeliness, if you would. But the features monolith standing before us now was far too clean and silent to betray any signs of life quietly held captive inside. It was eerie. The conclusion of our journey was punctuated with a loud hiss from the bus's air brakes that seemed to foretell the virulent horrors that awaited inside. We wouldn't have to wait till we entered the building for proof of the evil that lurked inside. For there on the loading dock, standing shoulder to shoulder, clad in full riot gear, were some 15 of the CDC's California Department of Corrections, Gestapo escape, Goon Squad, or Gooners, as they are commonly known. As the literal meaning of their name implied, they were hired thugs. These black helmeted body armored roughnecks staring from behind tinted face masks were strangely reminiscent of the fictional RoboCop, of the fantastical Hollywood box office blockbusters, except these ones weren't fighting to make the world a better place. In fact, any prisoners who knows any better will readily attest to the brutalities inherent in the seemingly sole purpose of these sociopathic COs, correctional officers. For the most part, CDC gooners are usually officers who have prior disciplinary problems in other prisons, where they have patternized history of prisoner abuse. Indeed, they seem to be genuinely gratified by some perverse pleasure they take in making life miserable for a prisoner, physically and otherwise. Their sadistic nature was now being evidenced by a loud cracking whip of intimidation that ripped through the air as these gooners, in unison, violently slapped shiny black batons in their palms of their leather-gloved hands. The eyes of those ones not wearing face masks glared with seething contempt that made very clear to us the utter spite with which they scorned us. Their eyes seemed to will us to give them a reason to pounce on us and give full vent to their twisted longings. Some prisoners instinctively took a do-or-die bravado in open defiance of the menace that imminently awaited us outside the doors of the bus. "Fuck you, motherfuckers," one black prisoner growled, no longer able to contain his anxiety. "Yeah, we'll get busy, all right," a white convict responded, echoing what he felt at that moment. But each knew good and well that the cold steel which restrained us only further left us glaring exposed to depraved whims of our keepers, defenseless. The last and perhaps more formidable defense as convicts that we had at our disposal was a unified stance in the face of a common enemy. And it was moments such as this one when bloody prison gang rivalries and bitter racial hatreds blurred into the midst of a more pressing need to band together to ward off the oppression and abuse at the hands of our tormentors. The philosophy was to fight a monster with a monster. And just as well, the CDC was no stranger to the power and bloodshed that could be unleashed by a mass of vengeful convicts whom had become organized in a reactionary force fueled by desperation and hatred. When this happened, it usually settled the score, corrected it, or at least alleviated it to some degree. The outrages committed against the prisoners. It is times such as this when men search within themselves for the courage and strength to rise to the call to freedom, to bravely face the prospect of death for a cause they believe in, knowing that under certain conditions there is simply no other way. It never ceases to elicit in me the deepest admiration to see the soul of a man so loftily exalted. Certainly, it is most inspiring to witness the phenomenon of people setting aside their differences to come together in defense of adversity. For it is through hardship and troubled times that the champion in man is evoked and makes itself manifest in a shining, brilliant glory that is the human spirit, tried, tested, and triumphant. Machiavelli, that shrewd and great mind, pointed out that since the earliest of times, as the human race increased, the necessity for uniting themselves for defense made itself felt. To better attain this object, they chose the strongest and most courageous from among themselves and placed him at their head, promising to obey him. Consequently, out of this were born leaders of men, and also an evil other than the one which brought them together in the first place, which Machiavelli says were the beginning of causes of disorders, conspiracies, and plots. Human nature being what it is. And so while I find myself in deep admiration for the human spirit when men prove themselves to be worthy of their sufferings and adversities, I also find myself both saddened and repulsed to see that at times in relatively peaceful conditions, left to their own devices, men usually revert back to the ways which render them intolerable and despicable mammals. This analogy is evident in the family circle that is plagued with inner feuding, sibling rivalries, and seemingly incurable enmities towards each other, and how all these suddenly cease during a time of tragedy such as that of a death in the family. It is then when they come together in support of each other, during the emotional trauma they all share, and thus in unity become stronger together and more appreciative of each other. Oddly enough, however, if they have not heeded the lessons of their troubles they had bestowed upon them, they inevitably return to their previous hostilities and contentions. Most of our impulses must be, as Nietzsche posited, double-edged. Every ideal presupposes love and hate, reverence and contempt. The essential impulse can arise from either the positive or negative side. Therefore, the ideal of many unifying with his others for the betterment of the whole has its opposite or dark side in the sins he is capable of and commits in the furtherance of the self. This seems to me a trouble we have the most difficulty ridding ourselves of. And while, if man is the highest and most noble manifestation of being, he is also, by his very nature, the most wretched. U.S. prisoners were no exception to this facet of human nature. Alas, most, in fact, were the epitome of that very wretchedness. The ideal of unification here in the SHU, unlike a normal prison setting, fails miserably because of its extreme practice of isolation. Our physical, concerted wall of defense against that common enemy crumbled at the gates of Pelican Bay State Prison. While we sat there in mass, I could actually feel the physical power of unity perishing. Yet still, in its effort to survive, I found refuge in the unity of spirit. But that too would soon come face to face with its greatest enemy, the foe found in sensory deprivation. Somehow we all sensed this. Our premonitions were imparted. Representations in the awkward stillness that descended over us as a burly sergeant in CDC regulation paramilitary uniform boarded the bus to greet us. He unlocked the steel security screen door that separated the driver and shotgun escort from the rest of the prisoner passengers on board. Arms akimbo, He stood there facing us, commanding the air of arrogant contempt of someone who rests snugly in the knowledge that any threat of hostility or retribution for his own offenses towards others is important and futile, a tyrant. Surely a man bound by steel cuffs and shackles, clad in a paper-thin jumpsuit, shod in scantily slippers, is no match for a full-body armored, heavily booted man armed and supported by a quadrant of willing subordinates at his command. There is simply no contest here, indeed. In such a predicament as this one, David would not stand a chance going against the Goliath without slinging stones. The proverbial underdog here could only bear the injustice of harm and humiliation with the last bulwark of the human soul, the shield of pride and courage. But too, the armor of pride and courage is of no consequence to the Department of Corrections. "All right, listen up," the sergeant bellowed maliciously. "Welcome to the Pelican Bay SHU. This is a hands-on institution, and we're here to serve. In other words, any wrong move you chose to make, we'll put our hands all over you quicker than you can make the next one. Any of you hard asses care to test the waters? Be my guest, cause we aim to please." He stopped abruptly, snorted, and allowed for this pause to sink his words into the minds of his resentful, captured audience. A low drum roll of disgruntlement rumbled through the bus and incrementally reached a fevered tempo like thunder in a crescendo. An uneasy chinkling of chains betrayed some of the convicts' uneasiness as they shifted anxiously in their seats. "All right, knock off the racket," thundered the barrel-chested sergeant, his voice seething within venom. "No one asked for your opinion, so knock it off." Only the chimes of shackles and chains broke the silence that now blanketed the prisoners. As if by cue, the sergeant slowly made his way down the aisle between the seats, clipboard in hand, stalking some unwary victim to make him an example of. His propensity, unjustifiable, inflict pain and humiliation on a prisoner. He stopped down the narrow footway right where Richie Boy and I were seated and glared at us like an angry Medusa. I looked forward as Richie Boy's eyes darted past me out the window in a combined effort to evade his provocation. It was obvious by now that the sergeant was acting upon some irresistible urge to hurt someone. You could see it in the flare of his nostrils, the tiny beads of sweat surfacing on his forehead, and in the white skin of his knuckles tightly clenching the clipboard. He was giving into impulse, that raw impulse to destroy something or someone. You could also hear it in the jagged edge of his voice like the scraping sound of a knife on bone. That these were not simply the exaggerated fancies of anxious, capricious prisoners could be seen in the froth forming at the corners of his cracked, grimacing lips. But most disturbing of all, even to some of us convicts hardened by years of violence and death, was that mad, glossy look in his eyes. For those of us who knew better, those of us who had seen that same look before in other prisoners, it was the unmistakable gaze of the criminally insane, except this criminal's gaze emanated from behind the sparkly shine of a brazen, seven-pointed star. Fully understanding the implication of the situation playing out before us, Richie Boy and I did what we could under the circumstances to make ourselves as anonymous as we could. The sergeant moved on, unperturbed by this, and continued in vain to search for some poor soul to stamp his authority. Everyone recognized this morbid little game, at least most of us, and as a consequence, we managed to rebuff his advances. Apparently, he was observant enough to take note of our collective unwillingness to be provoked into getting our heads smashed into the wall and being pummeled senseless, because he grunted contemptuously, strode back to the front of the bus, and in classic dictatorial fashion issued forth another of his tirades. Indeed, a brute of men Heinrich Himmler would have been proud to call his own. A guard stood behind the sergeant, assuming a John Wayne stance, cradling a 12-gauge shotgun across the top of his potbelly as the sergeant continued. "When your name is called off, you will leave your seat. Work your way to the exit and state your CDC number. Then, when ordered to do so, and only then will you step off the bus and place your nose up against the SHU entrance wall. You will not speak to each other or make any attempt whatsoever at communicating with the inmate next to you, nor with the COs around you. To do so will be considered an act of aggression, at which time the hands-on policy will be enforced. Is that understood? We all knew just as well as the guards did that the sergeant's authoritarian instructions were thinly veiled threats directed at us. And to further emphasize this, he tauntedly prodded, "Any problems? Any questions? Ask now." To the surprise of everyone on board, including the sergeant himself, a young black prisoner seated in front of me retorted vociferously, "Yeah, what time's supper, motherfucker?" For reasons beyond my comprehension, the youngster seemed to be testing the sincerity of the sergeant's admonitions. That he would opt to do so at the moment was without any conceivable rational basis, considering that this was exactly how the sergeant anticipated his plan would culminate. An unwitting prisoner taking the bait he so masterfully cast out into the veritable pond of prisoners. An act giving greater credence to the term fish, identifying newly arrived fresh-faced prisoners. In any case, the sergeant caught his fish, hook, line, and sinker, someone to make an example of. Yes, this vile sergeant was something of an expert at this setup and lure game now being played out, for he had the experience of years, flamed by a desire that had taught him so well. He chuckled knowingly to himself, insidiously smiling, sparing no haste to begin the business of viciously brutalizing the black youngster. "All right, inmate Daniels, you're first," he ordered. "Step up to the front." A couple of older black prisoners nearest the youngster whispered cautiously for him to watch himself as he stood to make his way down the narrow aisleway of the bus. "Straight up, bros," Daniel haughtily acknowledged them. Shoulders swung back like the wings of pride. He held his head high and loftily shuffled his way to the front. I simply don't believe that the gravity of what was about to take place was apparent to the young black prisoner. Or perhaps his power of discretion had dissipated into the deluding arrogance of youth. That blinding rush of adrenaline and stir of testosterone that magically and misleading donned the elusive remnant of invincibility in many a young man. Most of us convicts watching this now were well aware from experience of the trap that Daniels had ensnared himself in. He had just entangled himself like an unwary insect in the sergeant's web of deceitful hatred. I thought to myself, trying to count how many times in the past I too had fallen into similar traps, drunk with the same foolish pride of youth. What took place next went beyond the periphery of my experience in prison. The callousness and extent to which the sergeant and his pack of goons would give vent to the evil fury that smoldered in their poisoned hearts was shocking. Because of the restriction on the range of movement that ankle chains place on a prisoner when he walks, the youngster found it difficult to step down from the bus. Just as he was about to make the final step, he suddenly took the brunt force thrust of the sergeant's boot right between his shoulder blades, propelling him forward. "Supper time," snared the sergeant from behind as Daniels plunged forward into the waiting arms of terror, where an avalanche of unbridled savagery descended upon him. He was pummeled with a vicious barrage of blows coming from all sides. From inside the bus, one could hear the sickening sound of wooden clubs, cracking bones, and slap of hard wood on flesh. In the midst of this fury, the distinguishing sound of wood on wood knocked back and forth recklessly as the gooners swung their billy clubs, with no other place to land the blows except on each other's clubs. In a futile effort to ward off the assault, Daniels curled up in a fetal position. It was all he could do as the world around him mercifully swirled into the black embrace of unconsciousness. Still, terribly vicious blows continued to rain incessantly on what now had been reduced to an unconscious mass of broken bones and welted flesh. "Man, that's enough, motherfuckers. You're gonna kill him. Leave him be, punk-ass pigs." From inside the bus, an eruption of profanities exploded. Foot-stomping curses at what pitifully ever else we could muster in protest to the outrage we were witnessing only prompted some gooners who broke themselves free of the frenzy to grab the fallen prisoner by his ankle chains and drag him off into the mouth of the chute, whose portals we ourselves would soon pass. The other remaining gooners surrounded the bus and began to violently rap their batons upon its barred windows, warning us of what was to come if we didn't quickly abdicate our seats of protest. Looking back now, I remember what had just happened deeply disturbed me. It shocked me to the core. and by the look on their faces, it seemed to have had the same shocking effect on the other prisoners there as well. It wasn't so much what happened that unsettled me as it was how and by whom it occurred. For all my years in prison, I was by now inured to the sight of violent stabbings, strangulations, rapings, and suicides, all the violent realities inherent in prison life. And surely I knew too well that many department officials had their share of wrongdoings behind the walls, from the common guard all the way up to the warden himself. But it was the swiftness, the unabashed release of inhibition, and the rapidity that the sergeant and his cronies demonstrated in execution of the act. The nature with which they had mauled the youngster was alarming, and even more so because they had all acted under the color of the law in their capacity as correctional officers, sadists with badges. And yet, this was not the full extent of what has been described above. What I'm about to give account of went beyond shock, even to my own stony conscience. I remember vividly that in one moment during the tempest of this unbridled violence, the gooners momentarily paused for their state of fury, and I happened to catch the dazzled vacant stare of one of them as he looked up. What I saw occurred in the space of a second that stretched itself into the eternity of my memory. For in that moment, the gooner's starry eyes locked into mine. I remember his chest heaving partly from exhaustion and partly from what appeared to be the release of some ecstatic energy. His leg quivered, he jerked, and suddenly I was struck with the ugly suspicion that he had just gotten off on the beating of a prisoner. Motherfucker nutted on himself. Dirty bastard. This is a strangely horrific recollection, to be sure. But at that moment, until this very day, I can't seem to shake this foreboding, uncanny feeling that what I saw was a face of human nature that God had not intended for man to set eyes upon. I realized then, with a certain apprehension, that guard on prisoner brutality here, taken to an altogether different level, as will be evidenced later on in the preceding story. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles and this exclusive reading of an unfinished book written by Hector Copas Gallegos from Salinas. I'm going to be working diligently on getting the rest of this book. I'll try my hardest and do what I can, but either way it goes, you guys got to hear an exclusive read on a book that he wrote himself. Copas was and is a legendary part of the Familia's history. Brown Bob, Corny, and Copas were said to have worked together on creating the NR and that whole movement. He is also the only C who attempted to avenge the unjust killing of another true NF legend in Michael Castillo. These are legends, so the next time you hear that word to describe run-of-the-mill, low-level has-beens, remember what I told you right here. I'll be reading the foreword in chapter 1 of my new book later this week as well. We also have a Q&A dropping, new calls behind the walls dropping, as well as 4 or 5 other episodes that we're trying to get out all to you by next week. You guys have a good evening. The PMM team, hope you're enjoying the new year. Keep it positive, and as always, thank you all for the support. And don't forget, if you haven't already subscribed to our other channel, subscribe now, as we'll be distributing the contents amongst both our platforms.